I think we'll get started this evening, continuing our journey through the third chapter of Pirkei Avos. No, the third chapter of Tanya. That's what happens when you confuse your shiurim, you see. Yeah, the third chapter of Tanya, that's what we're doing, and we've been talking the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about how you're supposed to meditate on Hashem's greatness and how important that meditation is and how it helps you, and well, that's really where we're going to get to tonight, how meditating on Hashem's greatness helps you have a meaningful relationship with Hashem. That's really where we want to go, because we talk about Hashem and we believe in Hashem and we have a connection to Hashem, but we don't necessarily always feel that it's so personal, and we don't necessarily always feel that it really gets us, in the most meaningful way. So what we've learned is that the neshama has three, what we call soul powers, three intellectual soul powers, chokhmah, bina, and da'as. And at this point, we've only really discussed what chokhmah and bina are. We're in the middle of the discussion of bina. We haven't yet completed it. And the idea is that if you use these faculties, if you use the power of the intellectual part of the neshama, it will give you the opportunity to connect to Hashem in a really deep and meaningful way. So we said that chokhmah is the flash of inspiration, the seed of an idea. That's when you first get the sense that there's something worthwhile, that there's something worth studying, worth pursuing. Now you've got to digest it, you've got to examine it, you've got to research it. That's called bina. And so far we've discovered that as far as Judaism is concerned, and specifically in the teachings of Hasidus, bina means to have a focused contemplation on Hashem's greatness. There are many ways that you could have bina. You could have bina understanding of many different things, and they don't have to be divine, and they don't even have to be Jewish. A person could have bina about how to run a business, and you could have bina about a concept in science. But here specifically, we're talking about the powers of the neshama. The neshama is not interested in scientific formulae, and the neshama is not interested in a successful business per se. The neshama is interested in a meaningful comprehension of God. What do we mean meaningful? That it's going to talk to me. That it won't just be more information that I have in the reservoirs of my brain. It should be personalized. It should inspire me. It should spur me on to do something or to feel something. And as we're going to learn this evening, the primary goal at this stage is to feel. Many of us go through the motions, right? Ever had that? You look at yourself and you think, I'm going through the motions. There's certain things that I'm supposed to do as a Jewish person. There's certain expectations that the Torah has of me. And I'm doing those things, going through those motions, achieving those objectives. It's not good enough. We want to have a sense of a feeling, a sense of meaningful connection between ourselves and God. How do you get there? How do you create this meaningful connection? How do you create this meaningful relationship? For that, the Alter Rebbe has taught us that there are three layers of contemplation about God that we should use. The first is what we call memale kol olmin, to reflect on the fact that whatever exists in the world, and as diverse and complex and vast as creation is, the reality is Hashem fills every single part of creation with exactly the correctly calibrated energy that it needs, and that should blow our minds. Wow! I'm impressed by the world. I'm impressed by the extent of creation. I'm impressed by the sophistication of the universe that I live within. But then to consider that at every breathing moment, Hashem is pumping into each dimension precisely exactly what it needs, that should blow my mind. And already at that point, I expand my perception of Hashem. And I say, you know what? God is not just my kind Father in heaven or the Creator X amount of years ago, but Hashem is this powerful entity that makes every single thing be exactly what it is at exactly this moment. Then the next layer of contemplation is Soivev kol omin. You think that's Hashem's greatness? Really? You think because it impresses us, you think something that impresses us is in fact what makes God great? No, Soivev, he's way beyond that. Sovev implies something which encompasses all areas, if you can imagine, like, for example, the Earth's atmosphere around the Earth. It doesn't matter where on the globe you are, it's equally distant, or equally removed from the reality on earth. Sovev kol almin, it doesn't matter where you are. If I look at the fact that Hashem has allowed this spectacular concept of a ladybird, or if I look at the fact that Hashem has allowed this profound reality called the spiritual realm of Atzilus, it's actually irrelevant. Sovev kol almin, just as removed or beyond as God is from that little insect, that's how beyond the highest spiritual realm he is too. Now that's going to definitely expand my appreciation of Hashem, and that's going to cause me to have much more enthusiasm. Wow, God is truly great. It's not sloganism. It's a profound insight. God is truly great. And then last week we said, but the ultimate is when you realize kula kamei kelo chashiv, that before Hashem everything is of equally zero value. That doesn't mean that God doesn't ascribe a value. That means that there's nothing in the entire range of existence that is important enough that it should make a difference to him, that he should become better for our behavior or worse for our failure. Which is a phenomenally powerful insight on the one hand. It's quite a scary thought on the other, because it makes us wonder, so what's my place in all of this? If nothing is of so-called value in Hashem's eyes, why am I here? What does he want of me? So we'll learn that. Through the course of the Tanya, we'll learn, well, that's exactly the point. Much later on in Tanya, we'll come back to this and we'll revisit it and say, this is a reason why a human being should actually never be depressed. Because when you reflect on the fact that God, who is so infinite, decides to make you, that obviously gives you value. Not because you have value that you create, because that could leave you feeling a little bit high and dry at some point, but value because he ascribes you value. But we'll get there. We'll get there later. For now, the focus is to say, that objectively, nothing of the whole of existence is powerful, meaningful, important enough to make a dent in Hashem's reality, so to speak. So what's my response supposed to be? One thing that we know, it's the reality of being human, is that the minute you come to understand and appreciate something, it will cause you to have a certain sentiment towards it. So, for example, let's say that you meet somebody and you don't really know them. You meet them now for the first time. As you get to know them, as you get to know more about them, as you get to understand their humor, their intellect, their character, their kindness, so you start to like them. It's really difficult to have a meaningful sentiment about something you are pretty much ignorant of. So as we contemplate, so we translate our experience of God from being far and abstract outside of our daily reality, and so we make it more personal. And as it becomes more personal, and as it becomes more tangible, and as it becomes more real, so we develop a meaningful sentiment. Any meaningful relationship doesn't just happen in the mind. Interestingly enough, meaningful relationships have a tremendous amount to do with the mind. But a meaningful relationship can't just happen in the mind. It's got to have sentiment. It's got to have feeling. It's got to have real, tangible emotion associated with it. So we've described 3 levels of contemplation. Now the Alter Rebbe will tell us that the result could be 3 levels of sentimental connection to God. 3 levels of meaningful relationship. So let's have a look. We'll go straight from the beginning just to give it the flow. Because the intellect that resides within the component of the soul, let's just make this easier for everybody to see. Sorry, one sec. There. The intellect that resides within the intellectual component of the soul, when it contemplates, and it delves deeply, to the extreme. So we already saw that the Alter Rebbe was preparing us for the fact that there are going to be 3 layers of contemplation. There's regular contemplation, mizboinen, there's deep contemplation, mamek, and then there's extreme contemplation, me'oid. What do you contemplate about? Bigdulas Hashem, Hashem's greatness. The only way in which you can create a sense of relationship with Hashem is to think about his greatness, and not in the comic book sense. Oh, God is all powerful. He's some kind of a superhero. He throws down lightnings from the heavens. So what are we supposed to contemplate? How Hashem is memale kol almin, level 1 of contemplation. That Hashem fills the world with every single thing that it needs, with every bit of energy, with every bit of definition. Not only that, v'soivev kol almin, but Hashem is completely beyond anything that exists within the creation, and his relationship is from afar. And v'chula kamei kolochashiv, as we learned last week, the third layer of contemplation is to actually recognize that nothing has a true value to Hashem. What will that do to a person? So noilda v'nisoirera, what is born out of this and what is aroused inside the person, it's very carefully chosen language, because that's how emotions are. Emotions get churned up, nisoirera, they get awakened. But it's interesting also, he uses the expression noilda. Sometimes you didn't even know that you had the capacity for that emotion. I think that's a big issue that we have. Whenever we're in a situation, we find it near impossible to imagine that we could be in a different situation. So that's the expression over here, what's at least alluded to in the expression of nolda, of something being born. Can you imagine, before it happens, before it's, so to speak, born, you're absolutely oblivious to the fact that it could happen. And that's exactly what he's describing over here. So before a child is born, everybody's wondering, once upon a time, in the day before they had scans, right? You had no idea what the child looked like. So you were kind of dreaming and wondering, what's the child going to look like? How's it going to come up? Will it look like the father side of the family, mother side of the family, whatever the case is? Here we're saying, Noilda, the emotion that you will experience, the meaningful connection to God that you will feel after doing real, deep, connected contemplation is something you would never have guessed possible. Not only could you not imagine what it would feel like, you could never guess that such a thing could be possible. It's a fascinating truth of life. Before something happens, very often we are unaware that it could happen. And then once it happens, you're like, oh, this is normal. So if you look at your life over the course of a lifetime, it's really difficult to remember exactly how life was before certain critical milestones. So let's say, for example, after a person's married for many years, it's very difficult to remember how you thought as a single person. You'll have memories of life as a single person. It's really difficult to remember how you saw the world as a single person. Before a person becomes a parent, it's near impossible to imagine what it would be like to be a parent. And everybody tells you and how beautiful it is, and you should look forward to being a parent, and so on and so forth, so much bracha. But you can't begin to experience, you can't begin to imagine what it is to be a parent. Next thing, this baby comes along, and you are forever changed. It's bizarre. The child doesn't even have a name yet. You haven't yet made personal contact. Physical contact you've made. But the child hasn't even smiled yet. And might not smile still for X amount of time. And you're already completely, not just besotted with this child, but you find that you are so protective over this child. Where did that come from? Did you anticipate it? No. So we see in human experience that it is possible for a person to develop a meaningful relationship that you had never dreamt of developing. People could tell you about it, they could describe it to you, you could nod your head, giving the impression that you know what they're talking about. In the meantime, you are oblivious. You cannot begin to dream of the love of a parent to a child until you're a parent. You cannot begin to dream of the possibility of a real emotional connection to God until you experience it. Noilda. It's something that will be born into your life. Something that will enter your life that you never thought that could happen. So what are the emotions that a person would feel or sense with regards to Hashem? I think most people would probably assume, and we are going to talk about it, that you're looking for a love emotion. Because what's love at the end of the day? It's what brings people together, right? So I want to get closer to God, so you're going to expect a love relationship. We'll talk about that. Yes, of course. A love relationship is a key element of having a meaningful connection to God. But any person who believes that the relationship between us and Hashem is just love is out of touch. Actually, for the purposes of our conversation, anybody who believes that the relationship between two individuals who claim to love each other, when I say claim to love each other, they really love each other. That's why they're claiming it. A husband and wife, a parent and child, two dear friends. Anybody who tells you that that relationship is only love is out of touch. It doesn't work that way. For example, God forbid something goes sour in the relationship. Or God forbid the person that somebody loves passes away. That love translates into, in the first case, hurt, and in the second case, terrible sadness. It's not just love. Love is not this kind of neatly packaged two-dimensional experience. Love is complex. Love is layered. Why is a parent so protective over a child? Why will parents do such bizarre things for their children, even to the extent of endangering their own lives so that the child should be safe? Why? Because believe it or not, hand in hand with deep love is fear. The more you love someone, the more you fear, what if? What if, God forbid, something happens to them? What if, God forbid, something happens to our relationship? So when we talk about love of God, nobody should ever convince us that love of God is all this happy, clappy, la-di-da stuff of just love. No, it's not that simple. It's far more complex than that. So the Alter Rebbe says, let's start at the beginning. What is the first emotion that a person has when they encounter something that blows their mind? You say, I love it? Not necessarily. Maybe you'll come to love it over time. So, the first thing that occurs in the person's experience as you contemplate Hashem's godness is midas yiras haroimamus b'moichoi u'machshavtoi. In classic terms, we always talk about the brain as the seat of intellect and the heart as the seat of emotion. But here we're going to blur those lines slightly. Because we have a principle. The principle says that any time two entities somehow impact each other, that means that there has to be some kind of crossover between the two entities. So if you had to think, for example, about dominoes, how do dominoes work? You've got all your dominoes lined up. This first domino, in order to get the second domino to fall, also has to fall. Right? The first domino doesn't stand at the beginning of the line and go, and then everybody falls, right? The first domino has to fall. That means to say, the first domino enters into the kind of experience that the next domino is going to have. Now, the truth is, it's not a great metaphor because ultimately each domino remains absolutely distinct from the other domino. They might all fall. The impact might be from the one to the other. There may be a chain reaction, but you don't see a change fundamentally in the first domino. See, here's a different example, maybe a better example. If, as we've described, in order to have a meaningful emotional connection to something or to someone, you first have to have an understanding, that isn't just a domino effect. And in fact, when you think about it, it doesn't really seem to make sense. How does the brain, which is by nature cold and calculated, how does that stimulate emotions which by nature are quite excitable? It doesn't seem to make sense. They tell a story, I don't know if it was Freud, but they tell a story that there was one of the great leading psychological thinkers of the 20th century, or maybe it was still in the 19th century, who met the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe of Chabad. And he said to him, you do realize that the intellect and the emotion are two continents with an ocean that divides them. And the Rebbe Rashab said, yes, and there's a way to create a bridge between the two continents. In other words, the way people think about it, intellect and emotion should really not have anything to do with each other. In fact, they should contradict each other. In our own experience, how often is it that your mind tells you one thing, but you still feel differently? For example, you go to the dentist. No offense to dentists, right? You go to the dentist. What does your mind tell you? This is important. It's not the most traumatic thing that's going to happen to me in my life. They'll give me an injection. Everything's going to be fine. That's what your mind tells you. You still get butterflies. Why? Because intellect and emotion don't operate on the same frequency. That's why in so many of the anxiety-provoking situations that we have in our lives, we try all the intellectual self-talk. It helps to a certain extent. It doesn't help altogether. Why? Because they're two different worlds. How often is it you have people who, for whatever reason, have a conversation that goes along these lines? Don't be impulsive. Don't be emotional. Hear the facts. Why? Because they seem to be two contradictory worlds. And yet Hasidus tells us something incredibly insightful, and that is that within the realm of intellect, there is what we call midos sheba moichin. There is an emotion-like element within intellect. And within emotions, there's an intellectual-like element with emotions. We'll just talk about the first one for now. The difference between intellect and emotion, simply put, is that intellect looks at things objectively, emotions subjectively. Intellect wants to know what are the facts. Emotion says, how does this affect me? Objective versus subjective. But in the intellectual process, every one of us will form our own biases, our own perspectives, our own bent, our own leaning. Some of us will lean towards, more liberal thinking. Some towards more conservative thinking. Some of us will lean more towards more scientific thinking. Some of us more to creative thinking. Every one of us has our particular leaning, intellectual leaning. That is what we call the movement of intellect in an emotional fashion. In other words, it's where my intellect is no longer absolutely impartial. I start to react. I haven't yet felt anything, but I start to react. My mind starts to turn the information from pure information into how the information, it's like an assessment. How does this information impact me? The first stage of emotion is Nolda v'nisayrara. There's an awakening of midas yiras haroimumus, which we'll describe in a second, that there's this certain experience where I start to respond in my mind. What do I respond with? Yiras haroimumus. Now, when people use the word yira and they translate it in English, that's where the trouble begins, because the translation of yira is always fear. And fear has such a negative connotation. And as a result of that, so many people say, I'm not interested in a Judaism that is fear-based. And you're right. Is that how you want to live? You want to live your whole life worrying? Oh my gosh. Oy gewalt, what did I do wrong today? I think this is where Jewish guilt comes from. The sense of yira. God is looking over my shoulder, breathing down my back, waiting to catch me out for something that I've done wrong, and then he's going to smite me. And of course, if you read the Tanakh with that kind of bias, you're going to see a lot of smiting. So what is yira? The better translation of yira? Yira is a mental state. It's not an emotional state. Look what he says. It's it's something that happens in your mind. And not just is it an intellectual state, but he says we're talking about a very specific kind of yira, yiras haroimamus, which is probably best translated as awe. Rather than fear, awe. To stand in awe of God's supremacy. Let's try and relate this to something that we could personally relate to. Let's say that a person went to a part of the world, you're very, let's say, into nature, and you decide you're going to go to a part of the world that you've never been to before because you want to see something that is one of the wonders of nature, like the Victoria Falls, or Kilimanjaro, or the Sahara. In any one of those cases, when you arrive, no matter what you've imagined, no matter how many pictures or documentaries you've seen, when you arrive there, it's breathtaking. You're in awe. I remember when we had the very, very interesting experience of going to Mount Meru in Tanzania. That's not far from Kilimanjaro. And I remember arriving at the base of the mountain, and it was a somewhat cloudy day. I wouldn't say it was overcast, but somewhat cloudy day. I remember standing at the base of the mountain and looking up and up and up and up and seeing the clouds and realizing that there was another whole part of the mountain that was above the clouds. Now, it wasn't like Table Mountain, where sometimes you get the cloud on the mountain. These clouds were where clouds usually are. At whatever it is, 4,500 meters up. And the top of the mountain was still beyond that. That was an awe-inspiring moment. It's like, this is so grand. This is so big. This is so towering. I'm gobsmacked. I don't know what to say. I feel so puny. So the element of awe, it's not a feeling yet in the emotional sense. It's a sensation in your brain that says, I'm trying to process this. This is beyond me. As a person contemplates Hashem's greatness, that's what begins to happen. Your brain starts to go, wow, that is massive. As cold and as impassive as the human brain is, this kind of understanding even wakes up the brain. And then what happens next? Suddenly the person is in awe of and even ashamed of Hashem's greatness. Why am I ashamed of Hashem's greatness? So think of it again in terms that we could relate to. Imagine that there was a person who really deserved your absolute idolization. Let's just assume such a person existed. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and we were just talking about doctors during COVID and the stress that they're under. This person has a family member who's unfortunately in the ICU. And I was thinking, in the course of the conversation, and it actually came out in the conversation, if at the end of the COVID pandemic, people still idolize celebrities, then we've learned nothing. We should be in awe of the medical professionals, the healthcare professionals. That's who we should be in awe of. So let's imagine that there was an individual who, for whatever reason, you are completely in awe of. You just think that the most powerful, amazing. Imagine, like they often ask that question, if you could meet one person from history, who would you choose? So think now for a minute about who the one person in history is that you would choose to meet, because that's, to you, the most incredible human being you've ever encountered in all of your reading. Imagine if that person walked through the door. I don't know, they come up with some crazy technology and they could bring people from the past. Whatever. The person walks through your door. What are you going to feel? Shock, first of all, because it's so unexpected. Followed by awe. Wow, I am in the presence of greatness. Followed by a feeling of shemsech. Oh my gosh, if I had known you were coming, I would have behaved differently. I would have prepared. I would have dressed different. I don't know. The minute a person truly appreciates the infinite vastness of Hashem's greatness, two things happen. You're in awe, and you feel, oh my gosh, I'm totally inadequate. I'm embarrassed that this is how I appear before God. It's not the kind of embarrassment where a person feels ashamed of who you are, as if you failed. Just realize, it's like when that great person walked through your door. What did I do to deserve this? How come you have chosen me, favored me, given me attention? Wow, I'm embarrassed. That's it. So the first response that a person has to this very deep contemplation about Hashem is awe and a sense of, I'm honestly embarrassed. That God felt I have a role to play. I'm overwhelmed. This is very different to what people usually translate as fear. I'm not afraid. I'm overawed. Far healthier way to describe it. That's what happens in the mind. It's not a long journey from that experience in the mind to how it feels in the heart. Or pachad Hashem beliboy. Yira is a very mature state. It's a state of being in awe. Pachad is a more base, almost primitive state of real fear that you feel in your heart. Now again, you could feel fear because you feel like you've got to get out of there. God forbid there's a threat and then the person feels fear, the fight or flight response, and you got to get out of there. Okay, fine, fair enough. That's not what we're talking about over here. When that individual who you have idolized, that you believe to be the greatest human in the whole of history, when that individual walks through your door, the palpitations in your heart are not because you're afraid that something bad is going to happen. It's because when you're overawed, you feel a sense of fear. Not fear of the negative, fear of the overwhelming reality. It's just too much. That is the first stage of a meaningful relationship with Hashem. It's called perspective. To realize in the face of what greatness I stand. But we don't get stuck there. As you wouldn't get stuck if that amazing human happened to walk through your door. You wouldn't get stuck in the experience of awe and fear. Picture the scene. Picture the scene. Open the door. There is that person standing there. That person that you believed you would never get to meet because they lived 500, 2,000 years ago, whatever it is. Moshe Rabbeinu is standing at your door. Visualize. How would it work? So you'd open the door. For the first nanosecond, you wouldn't even register who it is because it's so unexpected, you wouldn't even register. Then you click who it is. Yiras Harem. Wow. Totally overawed. Then you start to think, oh my gosh, I was caught unawares. I'm not ready for this. And then what do you feel next? You feel thrilled. Oh my gosh, you can just imagine almost like a high school girl, shrieking and jumping up and down and saying, yes, you came, you're here, you're in my house, kind of response. Because when you have a meaningful appreciation of Hashem's greatness, when somebody rocks up at your door unannounced, you don't have a meaningful comprehension of what's happening. It just happens. And now you got to deal with it. When you have a meaningful appreciation of Hashem's greatness, then together with the awe and relative to the awe, you feel an excitement building. Why? So look what he says. V'shuv, the next thing that happens is, Yislahev liboy, a person's heart begins to flame, be'ahava aza kerishpei eish, with an intense love that is compared by our sages to flames of fire. B'chasheka v'chafetza u'tshuka v'nefeshokeka l'gdulas and sof baruch hu. And this incredible love that a person has becomes a yearning and a desire and a thirst and a pining soul to connect to Hashem's infinite greatness. In other words, and this is where you see the healthy balance. Because if any person was going to live their whole life even in a state of being overawed, I don't think that's sustainable. What happens at the same time is as you feel the tremendous magnitude, as you feel the overawed sense of God, so you feel the urgency to connect. Let's change the parable slightly. So the person who's the greatest person in your whole life doesn't arrive at your door, they arrive on your street. Now, you'll still have the same feeling of awe, you'll still have the same feeling of embarrassment in the sense of, oh my gosh, I had no idea you were coming. But as the crowds start to form around this personality, you're suddenly going to feel the urgency. I need to get there. I need to be close. I don't know if this is ever going to happen again. I need to be in that space. I need to be in that environment. That's what happens with true meditation on Hashem's greatness. As soon as I feel awe of the greatness, I feel urged to connect with it. And he calls this an intense love like fire. Why like fire? Later on in Tanya, we'll talk about this again in greater detail, but we do know that King Solomon says that the neshama is compared to a flame. Ner Hashem nishmas Adam. The candle of God is the soul of man. And what's the nature of a flame? The flame is always pushing upwards. It defies gravity. Everything else in the world is bound by gravity. So that we always talk about 4 basic elements that everything is created out of. We spoke about them already in chapter 1. 3 of the elements are bound by gravity. Earth, definitely. Water, a little bit less so. And air, even though air is kind of less grounded, but it still is within the space of the gravitational pull. Fire fights against it. Fire wants to rise upwards. And the Rambam says something fascinating. He says the reason that fire wants to move upwards is because the spiritual source of all fire is above the earth. And every one of these 4 elements wants to reconnect to its source. So earth stays put because its source is earth. Water always runs downwards. And while air might move in different directions, it will never move solely upwards. Fire defies all the laws of gravity because it's trying to connect to its source. That's this love that we're describing. It's not just that I'm in awe of God. Wow, God is amazing. Wow, God is great. I suddenly recognize, hey, that's where I come from. That's the source of my soul. We learned in the previous chapter that the nefesh elikis, the divine soul, is chelek elokam imal mamash. It's a piece of God. I'm not just chasing my childhood idol. I'm seeing the source of me. I'm seeing the opportunity to be connected back in a tangible, meaningful way with my own source. I want to be there. And it becomes almost obsessive. Just like, as again King Solomon says, there's a principle called choilas ahava, that a person could become so in love with a person that you actually get sick. What does it mean you get sick? You lose your sense of normality. You lose your sense of order. It becomes an obsessive chase to be connected to this person. That's what happens when we contemplate Hashem's greatness. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine you sitting there doing your meditation on Memale Kolamin and Sovev Kolamin and Kula Kamei Kelochashiv, and you reach a point where you are so acutely conscious of Hashem's infinite greatness that not only do you sit there in awe, but you feel an urgency. All I should be doing in my life is anything that will connect me to God. You think you'll have a hard time being religious? You think you'd have a hard time dealing with the distractions of the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara? Where from? All I want, it becomes obsessive. All I want is to connect to God. Now, obsessive could also have a negative connotation, because obsessive could mean that maybe I'll do things in this state that are actually dangerous to me. That's possible. And that's what he's going to describe now. Not, God forbid, that it should reach that point, but just to describe how it works. Vehi kelois hanefesh, this experience of this highly intense drive of love towards Hashem is described in our writings, in our Torah writings, as kelois hanefesh, what they translate as the expiration of the soul. Kidechsiv, as it says, King David says, my soul has yearned and even expired towards God. Uchsiv, also King David says, my soul thirsts for God. Uchsiv, and also in Tehillim it says, my soul thirsts for you like a person who is in a desert. Thirst is not a benign state. When you're thirsty, it's urgent. When you're thirsty in the desert, it's an emergency. That's how King David wants to describe the feeling of the soul to God. Tzama lecha nafshi. My soul thirsts for God. And so I'm going to do whatever it takes to quench that thirst, to survive. He's going to explain a little bit more, just kind of in terms of background. It's quite natural, and you don't need a tremendous insight into the world of science or biology to know this. Everybody appreciates thirst is a result of heat. Right? If it's really hot, you're going to be thirsty. Thirsting for God is a result of the fire of your neshama. Okay? metaphorically. In the same way as there's the concept of thirst being generated by heat, the concept of thirsting and yearning for Hashem is generated by the fire of my neshama. What's the fire of my neshama? She'esod ha'esh hu belev. The fire of a person is always in their heart. The fire of a person is their passion. The fire of a person is the excitable part of the person, and that's the part of us we want to excite. The ideal Jewish state of excitement is to be excited to connect to God. That's what you know what happens. We get excited about all kinds of things. We get excited that the new series of our favorite TV show is coming out. We get excited that the lights are on. We get excited by the fact that we could go eat in a restaurant again, please God, speedily nowadays. Those are the things that excite us. The ultimate Jewish state of excitement is, my neshama is excited to connect to God. Whereas on the other hand, the water feature, the water element within the human experience is in the mind. Water is cool. As Eitz Chaim, which is a classic Kabbalistic work attributed to the famous Arizal, he says, the wisdom of the godly soul is compared to water, but we're not focused on water right now. We're focused on fire. So what do we want to achieve? What's our goal? Our goal is, as Jewish people, to forge a meaningful relationship with Hashem. Not just simply to go through actions. Not just simply to fulfill mitzvahs. Of course we have to fulfill mitzvahs. That is our primary requirement. But what's our goal? Our goal is to feel the connection. To have a meaningful connection with Hashem. How do you do that? There's no slacktivism over here. There's no shortcut. We have to learn. We have to learn about Hashem's greatness. Then we have to take the information that we have learned out of books, and we have to spend time applying our mind in a contemplative, meditative way to what we have learned until it becomes clear in our minds. How do we know that we've succeeded in doing that? How do we know that we've got that information clear in our minds? When we feel stimulated with a powerful yearning, really all I want is just to connect to Hashem. That would be the ultimate Jewish state. So obviously that means then that we have to get this information, right? You can't expect to contemplate on an empty tank. You've got to have information to work with. You've got to have something that you could use as your means to be able to reflect and to meditate. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here with Tanya. The first part of Tanya will explain to us how the neshama operates. The next part of Tanya will explain to us what happens when we succeed or, God forbid, fail in working at least along the lines of our nefesh elokis, our godly soul. And then the bulk of Tanya is going to feed us the information that will help us to be able to meditate properly and think properly and have clarity about Hashem's greatness so we can have a meaningful relationship with Him. So the last part of the chapter, which please God we'll do next week, we'll have to just explain how da'as plays a pivotal role in all of this. We don't yet know what da'as is, so that's how we'll wrap up the chapter, please God, next week.